A racist police officer sees a black woman searching through a nice car and assumes that she is trying to steal it, so he arrests her for no reason. Afterwards, the officer is informed that he just arrested a state attorney. Danielle Lawson stood in the middle of the parking lot, beads of sweat forming on her forehead under the hot afternoon sun. The black SUV in front of her was unlocked. The driver's side door opened wide as she bent over the seat, shuffling through papers and stray receipts in a frantic search for her missing purse. Come on," she muttered under her breath, her fingers moving quickly as she rifled through the mess. She had already been running late when she pulled into the lot, but now she was in real trouble. Her phone buzzed for the third time, the screen lighting up with another missed call from her office. She didn't even bother checking it. Right now, her focus was on finding her purse, where her wallet, ID, and everything else important in her life were stashed. The faint hum of an engine caught her attention, and she straightened slightly, glancing up to see a police cruiser slowly pulling through the lot. The officer behind the wheel looked her way, and she quickly turned back to her car, trying not to draw any more attention. She didn't have time for this. Still, she could feel the officer's eyes on her as the cruiser rolled to a stop. The door opened and heavy boots hit the asphalt. "Hey," a rough voice called out. Danielle froze, fingers still on the edge of the car seat. Her heart sank as she straightened up slowly, already anticipating what was coming. She took a deep breath and turned to face the officer. He was a white man, middle-aged, with a hardened face and a scowl that seemed permanent. His uniform was crisp, though he wore his authority with a casual arrogance, his hand resting on his belt. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, voice sharp and suspicious. Danielle wiped a bit of sweat from her forehead and took a step back from the car, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm just looking for my purse," she said calmly, keeping her tone even. "I misplaced it somewhere in the car." The officer's scowl deepened. "You got ID on you?" he asked, his hand still resting on his belt, as though ready to act at any moment. Danielle blinked, feeling her stomach tighten. "Like I said, I lost my purse," she explained, gesturing toward the car. "That's what I'm looking for. I'm late for a meeting." "Uh-huh," the officer interrupted, not letting her finish. "Late for a meeting, right? Step away from the vehicle." Danielle bit her tongue. She didn't want this to escalate. Slowly, she stepped away from the car, raising her hand slightly to show she wasn't a threat. "This is my car," she repeated, her voice steady. "I just need to find my purse and I'll be out of here." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on her, a mixture of suspicion and something darker flickering in his gaze. He took a step closer, his posture rigid. "Lady, you're acting real suspicious. You expect me to believe you just lost your purse in this car?" He glanced at the SUV, as if trying to spot some evidence that she didn't belong there. Danielle felt her patience fry. "Yes, it's my car," she said more firmly this time. "I'm the state attorney. I lost my purse. That's why I'm searching for it." The officer raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile creeping onto his face. "State attorney, huh? You got any proof of that? Because right now, all I see is someone breaking into a car." Danielle's jaw tightened. She didn't need this, not today, not ever, but especially not now. "I told you my ID is in my purse," she said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. The officer took another step forward, his hand now resting on the top of his holster. "Yeah, sure, just step away from the vehicle now." Danielle opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. She knew how this looked. A black woman alone in a parking lot, rummaging through an SUV without ID. She knew how people like this officer saw her. She also knew that arguing further would only make things worse. With a deep breath, she stepped farther back, away from the open door of the car. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to handle this without letting it spiral out of control. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't naive either. This kind of situation could go south fast. The officer, meanwhile, seemed to take her compliance as an admission of guilt. He circled the car, glancing inside, before turning his attention back to her hands. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Danielle's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait, what? Are you serious? I told you this is my car." But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped forward, grabbing her arm with one hand while snapping the cuffs onto her wrist with the other. Danielle felt a surge of anger and disbelief as the cold metal locked around her wrists. "You're under arrest," the officer said, his voice cold, "for suspicion of vehicle theft." Danielle couldn't believe it. Her purse was somewhere in that car, but she was the one being treated like a criminal. As he led her toward the patrol car, she cast one last look at her vehicle, feeling a mix of frustration and anger rise in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Danielle sat in the back of the police car, her wrists still cuffed behind her. The seat was hard and uncomfortable, and the smell of stale cigarettes hung in the air. She leaned her head back against the headrest, her mind racing. This wasn't how her day was supposed to go. Through the window, she saw Officer Mulligan standing by her SUV, peering inside with his flashlight, even though the sun was still blazing overhead. The suspicion in his eyes hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger, fed by the assumptions he had already made about her. Danielle sighed and glanced around the empty parking lot. A couple of people had walked by earlier, staring at her in the back of the police car, but doing nothing, their faces tight with discomfort. No one had stepped in to ask what was happening. The door opened suddenly, and Mulligan appeared, his face set in a grim frown. He pulled her out of the car roughly and turned her to face him. "Still no ID?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I told you," Danielle said, her voice steady but clipped. "My purse is in my car. If you'll let me get it, I can show you everything you need." Mulligan shook his head, ignoring her completely. "You expect me to believe that? You're just some law-abiding citizen who lost her purse. Come on, you're trying to steal that car. It's obvious." Danielle took a deep breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Look, officer," she said, doing her best to stay calm. "I'm the state attorney. That's my car. If you just check the registration or run a background check, you'll see everything's in order." "State attorney," Mulligan let out a short, mocking laugh. "Lady, you can't be serious. People like you don't get jobs like that. Now stop lying and maybe this will go easier for you." Danielle felt her jaw tighten, the anger bubbling inside her. "People like me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Mulligan ignored the question, leaning in closer with a sneer. "What I mean is that you're making this harder than it needs to be. You should have thought of a better story." "State attorney," he scoffed. "I've heard worse, but that's up there." Danielle stared at her, her patience thinning. She had spent years working her way through law school, fighting against every assumption and barrier people had placed in front of her because of the color of her skin. Now, standing here, handcuffed, facing this man who couldn't even bother to listen to her, all of that frustration boiled beneath the surface. "This is ridiculous," Danielle muttered, more to herself than to Mulligan. "Oh, it's ridiculous already," Mulligan said, taking a step back and waving another patrol officer over. "You think you can just waltz in here, steal a car, and get away with it because you've got a fancy job title in your head? No way." Danielle shook her head in disbelief. "I'm telling you the truth. Why won't you just run the plates?" Mulligan shot her an irritated look. "Why, so you can buy yourself more time. I know your type. You probably got a record. You think you're smarter than me, but you're not." Danielle had to fight back a retort. She knew better than to argue with someone like Mulligan in this situation. Still, every word out of his mouth felt like a slap in the face. She knew he wasn't interested in the truth. He had already decided who she was. The younger officer, a man with a clipboard, approached and glanced at Danielle, then looked back at Mulligan. "Everything all right here?" the younger officer asked, looking uneasy. Mulligan waved a hand dismissively. "Just a routine arrest. She's got some excuse about being the state attorney or whatever. Doesn't have her ID, though, so I'm booking her for attempted vehicle theft." Danielle clenched her fists behind her back, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her skin. She couldn't believe this was happening. "You haven't even checked the plates," she said again, her voice firm. Mulligan shot her a glare. "You can stop talking now," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you regret it." Danielle bit her lip, holding back everything she wanted to say. She knew this wasn't the time to push him further. Instead, she kept quiet as Mulligan and the other officers talked amongst themselves. Every second they wasted felt like an insult, a deliberate choice not to see her as anything but a criminal. After what felt like an eternity, finally Mulligan spoke. "We'll see what the truth is once we get to the station." Danielle didn't resist. She didn't have the energy to fight this any longer. As the door slammed behind her, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. This wasn't over, not yet. She knew the truth would come out, eventually, it had to. But the fact that she was being treated like this in the first place was a reminder of everything she had fought against her whole life. And as she stared out the window, watching the city blur past, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had gone through this exact same thing. People without the power or connection she had. People who had been silenced before they ever had the chance to speak. Danielle knew one thing for sure. When this was over, there would be consequences. Danielle sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. The sounds of the police station echoed around her, officers walking back and forth, phones ringing, and distant chatter that blurred together. She'd been through these kinds of places countless times, but always from the other side. Now she would release you properly, and then we'll deal with the rest. Danielle sat back down, knowing that soon enough the truth would come out in full. But she also knew this was only the beginning. The damage had been done, and there would be consequences, just not the ones Mulligan had expected. Danielle sat in the interrogation room, her hands resting on the metal table. The room felt colder now, the sterile atmosphere pressing down on her. But her frustration had begun to fade. She knew Mark was handling things, and soon this entire situation would unravel. The doors swung open with a creak, and Officer Mulligan entered, his usual swagger slightly diminished. He didn't meet Danielle's eyes right away as he walked to the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with crossed arms. His smirk wasn't quite as sure as before, though he was clearly trying to hold on to it. A few moments later, Mark entered, followed closely by the police sergeant in charge of the precinct, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a tired expression. The sergeant walked in with a sense of authority, his eyes immediately scanning the room. He had the look of someone who'd seen too many situations like this and was already aware something had gone very wrong. Danielle straightened up as the sergeant glanced at her, then at Mark. He cleared his throat and addressed the room, his voice firm. "All right, let's get to the bottom of this," he said. "I've been informed there has been a serious misunderstanding, Miss Lawson. You've been detained under the suspicion of vehicle theft, is that correct?" "Yes," Danielle said, her voice calm and controlled. "But I've explained multiple times that I am the state attorney for this city, and this is my vehicle. Officer Mullen refused to check my ID or verify any of my information." The sergeant turned to Mulligan, his expression hardening. "Mulligan, is that true? You didn't check her ID?" Mulligan shifted uncomfortably but maintained his defensive posture. "She said she didn't have her ID. She lost her purse. I followed protocol based on the situation." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. "You didn't follow protocol, Officer Mulligan. You failed to run her plates. You failed to perform any sort of background check. You ignored every piece of information she provided, including the fact that she's the state attorney. Instead, you profiled her and escalated a situation that didn't need escalation." Mulligan clenched his jaw, his face reddening. "She didn't have proof on her. I can't just take people at their word. We deal with liars all the time." The sergeant held up a hand to silence Mulligan, his expression stern. "That's enough. The issue isn't whether she had ID on her at the time, it's how you handled this from the start. Did you or did you not verify her identity through any other means?" Mulligan looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "No," he muttered. Danielle watched the exchange, her frustration simmering under her calm exterior. She had tried to reason with Mulligan, had given him every chance to check her information, but he hadn't. Now he was finally being called out for it. Mark took another step forward, his voice rising slightly. "And when I arrived, you still refused to acknowledge who she was. You continued to mock her and dismissed my explanation outright. You're not just negligent, Officer Mulligan, you're reckless." The sergeant's eyes narrowed at Mulligan, who was now standing with his arms crossed, his face hardening in defense. "You need to learn how to handle these situations properly," the sergeant said. "This isn't about catching people in lies. It's about doing your job thoroughly. You didn't do that, and now we've detained the state attorney under false charges." Mulligan scowled, but there was no denying the shift in the room. He was no longer in control, and everyone knew it. "I was doing my job," he muttered, his voice quieter now. Danielle finally spoke up, her voice cold and measured. "No, you weren't. You were abusing your power. You saw me and made a judgment without any evidence. You ignored everything I said because you didn't believe someone like me could hold a position like mine." Mulligan's eyes snapped to hers, anger flickering across his face, but he stayed quiet. The sergeant sighed and turned back to Danielle. "Ms. Lawson, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the way this was handled. We'll release you immediately, and this will be thoroughly reviewed." Danielle's eyes stayed on Mulligan as she spoke, her voice unwavering. "I appreciate that, but this isn't over. There will be consequences, not just for me, but for every person who has been treated this way and hasn't had the power to fight back." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The sergeant nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll see to it personally that this is addressed." Danielle's placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, and she stood up from the chair, ready to leave the room. But as she walked toward the door, she turned one last time to face Mulligan. "You should have listened when I told you who I was," she said quietly but firmly. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before you judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions." Mulligan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. It was clear he was still unwilling to accept the reality of what had just happened, even as the truth stared him in the face. Danielle walked out of the room with Mark by her side, feeling the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice, for now, was in her hands. But she also knew that this wasn't the end. There were larger battles to fight, and this was just the beginning. The next morning, Danielle found herself back at the police station, walking into the familiar building with an air of determination. Today was different. She wasn't here as a suspect or a victim. She was here as the state attorney, ready to ensure that Officer Mulligan faced the consequences of his actions. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on her, but she had pushed them aside, focusing on what needed to be done next. As she stepped into the meeting room, she saw Chief David Hernandez waiting at the head of the table. He was a tall, stoic man with a serious expression, his salt and pepper hair slicked back. Officer Mulligan was seated to the side, his posture tense. He looked up when she entered, his face betraying a flicker of discomfort, but he quickly masked it with the same hardened expression he had worn the day before. This time, though, it wasn't backed by the same confidence. Danielle nodded curtly at Chief Hernandez, then sat across from Mulligan. The tension in the room was thick, but Danielle was calm, collected. She knew what needed to be said, and she wasn't going to let Mulligan off the hook. Chief Hernandez cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice even but with a tinge of weariness. "Miss Lawson, I want to first offer a formal apology on behalf of the department for what occurred yesterday. I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that proper procedure wasn't followed. I assure you, this will be dealt with seriously." Danielle met his gaze, her face unreadable. "I appreciate the apology, Chief," she said, her tone controlled, "but apologies don't change what happened. My officer racially profiled me, refused to verify my ID, and escalated the situation unnecessarily." Mulligan shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He stared straight ahead, not meeting Danielle's eyes, but the discomfort in his posture was evident. Chief Hernandez glanced at Mulligan before continuing. "I understand, and I agree that Officer Mulligan's actions were unacceptable," Hernandez said. "That's why we're placing him on leave without pay pending a full investigation." Danielle nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on Mulligan. "That's a start, but this isn't just about me. It's about how many people like me get treated the same way and don't have the power to defend themselves. How many people have been in this exact situation but didn't have someone like Mark Edwards the call or a title like mine to pull them out?" Mulligan shifted again, his discomfort growing more apparent. He finally spoke up, his voice low and defensive. "Look, I didn't know who you were, okay? If I'd known, things would have gone differently." Danielle raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp. "That's the problem, Officer Mulligan. You shouldn't treat people differently based on who they are. You should follow procedure regardless of my position, but you didn't. You saw me, a black woman, rummaging through a car, and you assumed the worst." Mulligan opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again, clearly struggling to come up with a response. His usual bravado was nowhere to be found, replaced with a simmering frustration that he couldn't express in front of his superior. Chief Hernandez stepped in, his tone firm. Officer Mulligan, you were in the wrong, and this investigation will determine the consequences of your actions. You need to understand the gravity of this situation." Mulligan clenched his fists on the table, then spoke his words clipped and defensive. "I made a judgment call based on what I saw. I didn't mean to—" "What?" Danielle interrupted, her voice cutting through his. "To racially profile me? To ignore every piece of information I gave you? To refuse to even check my plates? You didn't make a judgment call. You acted on your own biases." Mulligan's face flushed with anger, but he swallowed his words, knowing he couldn't argue his way out of this. Danielle continued, her tone steady, but laced with authority. "This isn't about you not knowing. It's about how you handled the situation from the very beginning. And frankly, your apology isn't about what you did wrong. It's about trying to protect yourself now that you know who I am." Mulligan's eyes snapped to hers, anger flickering across his face, but he stayed quiet. The sergeant sighed and turned back to Danielle. "Ms. Lawson, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the way this was handled. We'll release you immediately, and this will be thoroughly reviewed." Danielle's eyes stayed on Mulligan as she spoke, her voice unwavering. "I appreciate that, but this isn't over. There will be consequences, not just for me, but for every person who has been treated this way and hasn't had the power to fight back." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The sergeant nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll see to it personally that this is addressed." Danielle's placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, and she stood up from the chair, ready to leave the room. But as she walked toward the door, she turned one last time to face Mulligan. "You should have listened when I told you who I was," she said quietly but firmly. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before you judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions." Mulligan didn't respond.